Story 1. I notoriously overthink my relationships to an obsessive-compulsive disorder extent. I know my girl is the one because no matter what headspace I am in, I know I would do anything to make her bad days better. It's the most selfless I have felt towards a person. Story 2. Every guy has a type. In my case, it was always artsy, neurotic, fragile types. Yeah, I know. And so this woman walked up to me at a party and said, I have to meet the fool who bungee jumped off a bridge in New Zealand. It didn't matter that this woman wasn't like any other woman I had ever dated. It was as if a door had opened up, and all I had to do was step through it. I literally knew immediately. We talked for a solid hour while her poor blind date looked helplessly on. Our first date was a week later, engaged 3 months after that, and married 10 months from the day we met. And that was 34 years ago, when you know. And truthfully, if you're having to talk yourself into a long-term relationship with someone, if you're just in a relationship out of inertia, then move on and find someone else. Story 3. It felt easy to make her happy. No acting, no need to triple-check what I was going to say or do. There was no question about whether she was being genuine or just humoring me. Oh, and every time there was an opportunity to choose spending time with me or getting an easy out, she always chose me. Every interaction just felt comfortable, like being wrapped in a blanket on a cold evening by the fire. It was different from every other relationship I had been in. Story 4. I didn't buy a ring until I was looking at my checking account balance one day and realized I had an extra $1,000 that I didn't know what to do with. I hadn't been saving up, I just hadn't kept track of it much because I was a pizza delivery driver and mostly used cash. The first thought I had was that I would buy her a ring. Not something for myself, not paying off a debt, not savings. But really, it was one of our first dates. We drove to a tulip festival in Washington State where we lived at the time. We spent all day together, joking and enjoying ourselves. And when we got back, I realized I wanted to keep hanging out with her. Even though we didn't live together. She's one of the only people I've ever met that I don't get tired of being around. We have our fights, sure, but we might take 30 minutes or an hour apart and both come back apologizing. 14 years and 9 years of marriage later, and I still never get sick of her. Story 5. I have an anxiety and panic attack disorder. The first time I had a panic attack in front of her, in my mind I knew it was over. I had a huge amount of shame around this and suffered alone. I went through a lot of extra steps in my life to ensure that I always had an exit to get away from people in case I felt a panic attack coming on. But this time, I was unable to get away, and she had to help me get through it. I couldn't even look her in the eye afterward. I was just hiding from her for a few days, but she kept texting me and telling me that whatever is up. She just hopes I'll be able to talk to her and looked forward to when we could spend time together. Eventually, I opened up to her, and in that moment, I felt like the farthest thing from a man, or how I perceived a man should be, that I could possibly feel. But she didn't do anything to make me feel that way. It was all in my head, and for the first time in my life, I realized that it has always been in my head. I had always assumed that people would think less of me, and I realized it was my warped definition of what manly is that was the problem. Story 6. Sometimes words cannot express how she makes me feel. Safe, secure, keeps me in check. I am a big fellow, and she is this itty-bitty thing, and yet, when I'm poorly, she always looks after me. Mostly, I never ask as I work through the pain. It's like she can read my mind and accommodates accordingly. I genuinely have no idea what I would do without her. Cannot imagine my life without her. Story 7. It was simple for me. I didn't want to be the other guy. I didn't want to see her deep into her career, in some amazing home, playing with her kids and just living her life with some guy. I needed that guy to be me. She was too amazing, and I wanted to be near her forever. It was a time for being mildly selfish. It hit me hard one day out of the blue that it was up to me to be the guy in that future. I proposed the next day. 13 years of marriage and 2 kids later, I am that guy. Story 8. Man, I'm not married yet, but I've heard some pretty wild stories from friends and family. The common theme seems to be when they just knew, like a gut feeling. One of my buddies said he knew his wife was the one because she saw him at his absolute worst, like a straight-up disaster. and not only stuck around but helped him get his life together without ever making him feel judged. Another friend said it was how they could spend hours together in total silence, and it wasn't awkward, it just felt like peace. I guess when you can be 100% yourself around someone, flaws and all, and they're still hyped to be with you, that's a huge sign. Also, a lot of people say they just knew without being able to explain it. Feels like a mix of comfort and excitement. What about you, though? Any gut feelings in your past relationships? Story 9. She captivated me. I was thrown off balance by her spirit and her vivaciousness. She cares for me every day and makes me want to be a better person. I love her so dearly and completely. Story 10. I was with my ex for 9 years. We got engaged during that time, but we never really made concrete plans to get married. We sort of just went along with life as the years passed without ever having the feeling of, I need to marry this woman. A few weeks after we broke up, she was having an affair. I met my now wife. I was obviously just out of a long-term relationship and still reeling from the shock of discovering the affair, essentially piecing my life back together. So I certainly wasn't on the lookout for the one. We met for a casual night together in a hotel. She was happily single, and I needed to blow off some steam. It was a mutually beneficial situation with the agreement that if it just turned out to be a one-off, we'd have a good time and go on with our lives. Well, we had a wonderful night together and ended up staying together all night and waking up together the next morning. There was an instant connection that I've rarely experienced. I'm not particularly extroverted, and as I get older, I've become less and less of a people person as the years have gone on. But despite having only known her a few hours, I was instantly at ease, and for the first time in weeks, I was able to relax. That morning, we slept together again, and I looked down at her, and our eyes met, and I vividly remember having the thought, I'm never letting you go, and told her as much. She smiled and simply said, okay. From that point on, we were basically inseparable. We bought a house together within a year. I proposed the day we got the keys, and we got married this year. I can't give you a concrete answer on how I knew. I just did. And I guess all I can say is that if you don't know, then maybe she isn't the one. Story 11. I was cooking us dinner while listening to music. A song I had never heard came on, and I imagined her in a wedding dress walking towards me. I began to sob and knew it was time to ask her to marry me. We had our first dance to that song at our wedding 2 years later. Story 12. Took her on a date to a hockey game. A fight broke out on the rink, and she stood up, threw her hands out while singing along to Let the Bodies Hit the Floor. And I knew I couldn't let her go. 18 years together now. Story 13. Because she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen in my life, and at the time my job included interviewing movie stars, so I had a basis for comparison, and that fact was the least interesting thing about her. She turned out to be smarter and far more sensible than I was, and I quickly came to realize that she was the whole package as a human. Besides, just being with her made me happy, and it still does. I knew a couple of months in we were going to get married. She tells me she knew after our first date. Either way, our 30th anniversary is next year. Story 14. After our third date, we haven't spent more than 24 hours apart. 8 years married now. After the first date, I counted the hours until the second date, then practically the minutes until the third. Prior to her, I had a couple of girlfriends and went on several first dates. Each of those was spent on weighing the pluses and minuses of the relationship or wondering what to do for the second or third date. With my now wife, the second and third dates weren't about what to do, but how to extend them so they would last as long as possible. Everything came naturally. I didn't feel the need to embellish my resume. Just being myself felt right. Her being herself was just right. Story 15. The second I started talking to her online, I knew it was different. I cannot explain it. I just knew I shouldn't mess that up. It's been over 20 years now, and I love her even more. Story 16. Not married yet, but she's the only woman I've ever met or been with that without fail lights a fire in my chest when I see her. Every time. I get goosebumps, my heart rate goes up a little bit, and the dopamine rush hits. Doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes, hours, days, or months. It happens every single time. We could get into a nasty fight, and an hour later when we sit down to talk it out, Bam! It hits me like a truck. Story 17. When I realized that both of us were completely being ourselves, there was no need to censor ourselves or live up to some unreasonable expectation. When the love they prefer to receive is not a chore, and the love they give you is more than you could have imagined. Story 18. On our third date, she asked if I was seeing anyone else, and I truthfully told her I was not. Moments later, I realized I would never want to, because I had just clicked with her so naturally. I didn't see it until then. A couple of years later, she told me that she thought the very same thing on that same date. Our 5-year anniversary is next week, and December will mark 10 years together. Story 19. My now wife was the only one I wanted to be around. I had to be reminded that I had other friends. Her presence makes me happy, and I am always a better person when I am with her. Story 20. She was the same person on date 10 as she was on date 1. She was almost the same girl when we lived together as the one she was when we weren't living together. All of that was a first for me. Story 21. Before meeting my wife, I remember dating women, and in my mind, I would constantly rehearse how I wanted or hoped conversations would go. I was always concerned about trying to act a certain way. When I met my wife at a party, we just clicked, conversations were natural, and I was 100% myself, no fear of being goofy or nerdy, which I really am. I moved back home when my father passed away. I recall my mother asking, "What in God's name do you two talk about? All you do is laugh non-stop." My mother was extremely happy, seeing how I was in a very toxic relationship during high school. My friends noticed that my personality was greatly improved. One of my female friends pulled my girlfriend aside and said to her, "You are exactly what he has been looking for." I know because my friend told me she said it, haha. I agreed with her 100%. After 4 months of dating, we moved out together. After 11 months of dating, we got engaged, and after 1.5 years, we were married. Now, we have 2 kids and are going to celebrate 15 years of marriage next month. Story 22. We accidentally went on a date when I went to pick up some money she owed me. She, her boyfriend, and their roommate were all friends of mine and needed to move because their lease was up and rent was being raised by several $100s, and I was supposed to move into a bigger place with them. They had a party one night, and I came by to drop off my application and money for the application fee. I intended to stay for a drink and then go home early because I had a wedding to attend the next day. She clearly had something bothering her, so when we were alone for a minute on their back patio, I asked what was wrong, and she told me she wasn't happy, didn't want to be with her boyfriend anymore, and was interested in somebody else. I spent the rest of the night trying to talk her through it, thinking they were great together and could still work it out. But the more she told me, the more I realized I had no idea who he really was. He had had a months-long affair with a girl who was still in high school while she was paying all their bills. He was a compulsive liar. He had been emotionally abusing her for years. Oh, and the guy she was interested in turned out to be me. Still, I tried to convince her to at least consider going to a relationship counselor with him and told her in no uncertain terms that I would never want to come between the two of them. But it all came to a head when he finally came out to the patio and berated her for abandoning him while he, unbeknownst to either of us, got too drunk and puked his guts out in the bathroom. He told her she had 5 minutes to convince him not to end things right then. She told him no. I ended up telling him I had just spent the whole night trying to convince her not to leave him, but there was nothing I could do for him now. 2 days later, it was clear they were officially truly done, and I was broke as hell and really needed that $35 back for the application fee that clearly wasn't going to be used now, since without her, he couldn't afford his share of the rent. She was the one I had given it to, so I texted her and asked if I could meet her for coffee when she got off work and get the money back. I also wanted to check in on her and make sure she was doing okay, as her now ex-boyfriend had become erratic and acting like he might get violent, and I had learned from some other friends that he was every bit the piece of garbage that she had made him sound like. Well, that quick cup of coffee turned into us chatting for hours outside Starbucks, and then I asked if she wanted to go get a drink, and then while we were at the bar I learned that she had lived in Virginia Beach for over 3 years and had never even visited the oceanfront, and we were only a few minutes away, so that travesty needed to be corrected right now, and soon we were at the boardwalk hitting the cheesy tourist traps. Then we were walking along the beach, and then we were climbing up into a lifeguard stand where we could look out at the stars over the ocean, and wouldn't you know it, there was an honest-to-goodness shooting star. If it was a movie, it would be too cliche to believe, and pretty soon we had been sitting up there talking for an hour or three, and then before I knew what had happened, she had slid right next to me and my arm was around her, and I knew damn well this had gone way beyond the casual friendship we had had a few hours ago. We looked at each other, and I told her if we weren't really careful, we were about to cross a line and we'd never be able to go back. And by the time I'd finished that sentence, I knew we had crossed it before we ever finished our overpriced lattes, and when we kissed, we both knew it was right. By the time I walked her back to her car, I knew that was my last first kiss. It has been 14 years since what we call our accidental date, and I swear I didn't consciously know what I was doing when I asked her for coffee, but deep down, I know a part of me had fallen for her when I was still trying to come up with reasons she should give one last chance to the guy she was clearly too good for, and I was too guarded and too stubborn to let myself see it.